In this lecture, we'll understand the role of financial intermediation of the banking sector. We're going to understand what liquidity transformation means, how you turn short-term savings into long-term investments, and how this is possible, how banks can play this role. And we're also going to study financial crises as they can happen as an outcome of coordination failure. Okay, so we'll understand how the banking system works in good times, how it's supposed to work, but how it can also malfunction, thus leading to financial crisis as an outcome of a coordination failure. Okay, and to do so, we'll rely on the standard model of a Diamond and Dybvig. Okay, so there's two sides in the investment market. So there is, on the one side, there's depositors with savings, and who might want to invest their savings. However, these depositors may face liquidity needs in the short to a medium term. So they have a short horizon. They're unwilling to invest for the long term if this means that they cannot withdraw their saving at short notice. However, of course, investing long term might give them access to higher returns. And this is how you build factories, how you're able to fund long-term corporate investment. So how can we reconcile these two objectives, right? To combine short-term savings with long-term investment. And this is where financial intermediaries come in particular banks. So bank can pool resources, so they get savings from all depositors, all economic agents with savings, and they will insure all these agents against liquidity shocks. And the idea is that they will say, okay, you can put money in the bank. The bank is going to invest some of this money to fund long-term investments, and all the savers who face liquidity shocks or would need to withdraw their money early will be able to do so. And how are they able to do that? Well, this is because there might be some uncertainty about the individual level, right? So each individual does not know whether he or she will need to get money in the short term. But there's not that much uncertainty for the whole population. So there's not that much aggregate uncertainty in the sense that banks know that it's going to be roughly, let's say, 20% of depositors who are going to withdraw their money in the short term, whereas 80% will be happy to remain invested for the long term. And of course, the key is that each individual investor does not know whether he will end up belonging to the 20% or to the 80%, right? Ex ante, there's still uncertainty at the individual level, but there's much less uncertainty at the aggregate level. So the bank knows pretty much how much money it's going to need to set aside for short-term withdrawals and how much it will be able to invest in the long term. Okay, so banks in this sense pool resources and will be able to insure agents against liquidity shocks by allowing them to withdraw their savings if they wish to do so. And so this is one of the main roles of financial intermediation or of a financial system in general. So you're able to combine long-term investments for corporations in particular, and the associated high returns, and liquidity for savers who often require this liquidity. So this can work very well. This can also lead to financial crisis because obviously there's going to be a liquidity mismatch, right? You're going to try to combine short-term savings with long-term investments. And sometimes that is not going to work. And we're going to try to understand when that is not going to work. Okay, so how does this work in the model of a Diamond and Dybvig? So the bank has access to two types of investments. The first one is a storage technology. So it's a short-term investment. And so you can transfer wealth over time, one for one. So $1 today will still be $1 tomorrow. So you just essentially store wealth, so you invest in very short-term, very liquid investments. Then you can invest in a long-term investment. So if you invest at time 0, long-term means that normally you intend for this investment to be liquidated only at time 2. And then if it is liquidated at time 2, this $1 will be turned into capital R dollars. So you'll get more than what you invested. However, this is a long-term investment that cannot be easily liquidated in the short term. So should you wish to do so, you will only get less than $1 back. And you only get R dollars back. So there's a liquidation cost if you wish to preemptively liquidate this investment. And you can think about it as, for example, you built a plant that's only going to produce several years from now, and somehow you need your money back before the plant is operating. Then you need to take apart the plant. You're not going to get all your money back if you do so, if you must preemptively liquidate your long-term investment. Okay, so to summarize, with a short-term investment, $1 at time 0 is turned into $1 at time 1 or at time 2. With a long-term investment, so you will get less if you liquidate at time 1, but you'll get more if you liquidate at time 2. Okay, now what about depositors? So all savers, people with money to put in the bank potentially. And there's going to be a continuum, so an infinite number of mass 1 of depositors, and each of them with $1 to invest in the bank. And so total deposits will be equal to the this continuum times $1. So it's essentially $1 of total deposit that the bank is going to get. Now there's to take into account the fact that depositors might be hit by a liquidity shock, so that they might wish to get their money back early, and early here in this model would be at time 1. We're going to assume that they can have 2 types. The first type is a so-called impatient depositor. And so in this case, your utility from consumption, and this is consumption C1 at time 1 and C2 at time 2. If you're impatient, you only care about your consumption at time 1. So your utility of consumption over 2 periods is only defined over the utility of your consumption at time 1. So you don't care about whatever you will consume at time 2. You want your money back right now to consume whatever you can at time 1. So you are impatient. You demand liquidity at time 1. And a depositor will be impatient with priority lambda. With priority 1 minus lambda, the depositor is patient, meaning that he does not care when he is going to consume. And so his utility of consumption over both periods is simply equal to the utility of his consumption at time 1 plus at time 2. So this patient depositor, because consumption at time 1 and 2 are perfect substitutes, this depositor is simply going to consume at whichever time allows him to maximize his total consumption. Meaning if he can consume more at time 2 than at time 1, he will be happy to consume at time 2. So he is patient. But crucially, so a depositor at time 0 does not know his type, right? He does not know whether he will turn out to be an impatient depositor or a patient depositor. He does not know when he will need his money back. He may need liquidity in the short term or not. Okay, he only learns his type at time 1. But now from the perspective of the bank, because it's facing a continuum of depositors, it knows the total number of impatient depositors. It will just be a fraction lambda of this continuum. And likewise, it knows that there will be a fraction 1 minus lambda of this continuum of depositors who will be patient in the economy. Okay, so there's no aggregate uncertainty. There's individual level uncertainty, but no aggregate uncertainty. And so in this sense, the bank is going to play the role of an insurer, just like an insurance company is going to insure people against fire, because there's some individual uncertainty, but not that much aggregate uncertainty in that regard, right? And how does a bank operate? Well, typically it operates according to a sequential service constraint, meaning that the bank will pay back deposits as long as it can at time one. Okay, so it's a first come, first serve assumption. And also, what is a bank going to do? So suppose it follows the following strategy, and it's going to invest lambda dollars in a storage technology, so that corresponds to the number of impatient depositors who are going to want their money back at time one, to consume at time one. And it's going to invest 1 minus lambda dollars in the long-term technology, and that would be to cater to long-term investors. So this number of long-term or patient investors who are going to be happy to consume more at time two. Because investing in the long-term technology will allow the bank to produce greater returns at time two. So what does it mean? So it means that at time one, the bank would have resources lambda. So it's lambda times 1 without liquidations from patient investors. But with liquidations from patient investors, it will get only this much from the storage technology. And then from the long-term technology, it will not get $1 back. It will only get little r back from whichever money was invested in the long-term technology. And so here, without liquidation refers to liquidation from patient investors. And with liquidation, it means with liquidation from patient investors, again, at time one. Okay, so in this game, there's going to be 2 equilibria. And the first one is can be referred to as a business as usual equilibrium. So that's when everything works pretty well. So let's consider the depositor and suppose that it does the following things. When he learns this type, so at time one, he's going to withdraw money if he learns that he's impatient, that he needs money right now. And he's going to keep his money in the bank at time one if he learns that he is patient, that he doesn't need his money right now. Okay, that makes sense. So what does this mean? So at time one, the bank will have resources lambda from its short-term investments. Now this is from this amount invested in the storage technology. And the demand from depositors at time one. So it's only emanating from impatient depositors. And so it's going to be equal to lambda times 1, which is just 0 and continuum. And so the bank is going to pay 1 back to each investor who withdraw at time 1. So each impatient depositor is going to get his money back. At time 2, so the bank invested 1 minus lambda dollars in long-term investments. So now it's going to get 1 minus lambda times R because these long-term investments pay off. There's 1 minus lambda patient depositors left. So who have not withdrawn their money at time 1 yet. And so the bank will be able to repay this amount. So divided by this total number of depositors. So that's an amount R for each of these depositors. Is this a Nash equilibrium? So now we have to make sure that the postulated strategies for impatient and patient depositors are indeed optimal. So to make sure that these strategies are compatible, we're going to study a Nash equilibrium. So what is a Nash equilibrium? A Nash equilibrium is a set of postulated strategies such that there is no profitable unilateral deviation. So if you take the strategies of all the other players as given, this is a set of postulated strategies. you consider a deviation, an individual deviation from anyone involved in the game. If there is one profitable deviation, it means that the set of strategies is not a Nash equilibrium. But if, given what everyone else is doing, no one has any interest in deviating, meaning in changing its strategies, in taking a different action than the one postulated, then you have a Nash equilibrium. Okay. So let's consider a deviation from an impatient depositor. So this one is pretty easy. So here, there's two actions available, right? You can withdraw your money at time 1 or at time 2. And here we postulated that an impatient depositor will withdraw his money at time 1, in which case he will get the utility of $1, which is what we get here. Okay. Now let's suppose that this impatient depositor withdraws instead at time 2. So he is deviating. So what is he going to get? Well, look at his utility function. If he withdraws 0 at time 1, his consumption at time 1 is going to be equal to 0. And well, he may be able to consume more at time 2, but this does not enter his utility function. And so given that C1 will be equal to 0, if he withdraws at time 2, his utility will be U of 0. And so here we verified that what he gets if he does not deviate, so if he follows the postulated strategy, gets U of 1, and this is greater than U of 0, which is what he would get if he were to deviate and take the other action. Okay, now let's consider a deviation for a patient depositor. So this depositor is supposedly withdrawing money at time 2. So what would happen if he were to withdraw instead at time 1? So then there's this sequential service constraint, right? So the bank must pay him back up to its ability to do so. So it needs to provide $1 to this investor. It has already paid back all its money from short-term investment to short-term depositors. So to pay back this $1, it will need to liquidate some long-term investment. Moreover, because there's a liquidation cost, because when you liquidate a long-term investment, you only get R, you do not get 1. So it will be insufficient to liquidate just 1 unit of the long-term investment. You need to liquidate a bit more than 1 unit. You need to liquidate 1 over R units. And because R is less than 1, this is greater than 1. Okay. So you need to liquidate not only this patient depositor's investment, but also you need to partially liquidate the investment of another patient depositor. Okay, so you can still fully pay back this patient depositor. Now it's going to, in the end, receive $1 because you're going to liquidate an amount 1 over R of long-term investments, and each of these investments is going to yield R. So in the end, you get $1. So you can repay $1 to this investor, who is going to get a utility of 1. However, there's less money available for other patient depositors, right? You needed to liquidate more than 1 unit to reimburse this $1 to this patient depositor. Okay, so in this sense, early liquidations exert a negative externality. You're going to lower the utility of other patient depositors by doing so. However, so here what matters is that if you take a patient depositor who withdraws at time 1, is going to get a utility of U of 1, which is here. What matters is that he is still better off waiting and getting capital R at time 2. Because U of R is greater than U of 1, because utility U is increasing. And so the key here is that we held the actions of all other depositors constant. We assumed that everyone was doing so, except for only one individual. And this is a key to verifying that we have a Nash equilibrium. We look for only individual deviations from the set of postulated actions. And so here what we found is that regardless of the type of depositor, you're always better off doing what you were supposed to do in this equilibrium. So withdrawing at time 1 if you were impatient, or withdrawing at time 2 if you were patient. Okay, so it's a Nash equilibrium. Perfect. So does it mean that everything is wonderful and perfect in this world? Well, not necessarily. And this is because Nash equilibria are not necessarily unique. So there can be other Nash equilibria in this game. So let's look for something else. To identify a Nash equilibrium, first of all, you have to postulate a set of actions or strategies taken by all the players in the game. And then you have to verify that given all these actions taken by all the players in the game, there's no unilateral deviation possible, so that everyone is indeed doing the best that they can, given what everyone else is doing. And so let's look for a so-called panic equilibrium. So why do I call it a panic equilibrium? It's because now we're going to postulate that everyone, regardless of their type, is withdrawing their money from the bank at time 1, whether they are impatient or patient. Everyone does the same thing. So what does this mean from the bank perspective? So at time 1, the bank has invested this amount in a storage strategy, so it's going to get this amount times 1. And it has invested this amount in the long-term strategy, so it's going to get this amount times little r, which is less than 1. And so the overall amount is going to be less than 1, and precisely because of the liquidation cost representing the fact that little r is less than 1. Okay, so these are the total resources available to the bank if each investor is going to withdraw money at time 1, and the most that the bank can raise from its investment is this much money. And the demand from depositors is each investor wants their money back, so $1, and there's a continuum 0, 1 of investors. So in aggregate, they want 1, but the bank has less than 1. And so it means that the bank can only repay a fraction lambda plus 1 minus lambda r of investors. Okay, it has this much money, but there's this much demand from investors. And what happens at time 2? Well, again, sequential service constraint. At time 1, the bank is going to run out of money. It will not even be able to repay everyone. So at time 2, the bank does not exist anymore. It's already bankrupt. There's absolutely no money left at time 2. Okay. So is this a Nash equilibrium? Let's verify. We can start with an impatient depositor. It's always easier. So if I'm an impatient depositor and I'm going to withdraw at time 2, well, I don't care about whatever I'm consuming at time 2, right? My utility is only defined over my consumption at, it only depends on my consumption at time 1. So if I withdraw at time 2, I get U of 0. Okay, so as long as I get more than U of 0 at time 1, I will be better off. However, this is also the case for a patient depositor who might be considering withdrawing at time 2, right? Because given what everyone else is doing, the bank will be bankrupt at time 2. even if one individual is going to deviate, right? It's not going to make a difference at all, given that everyone else is withdrawing their money at time 1. And so this individual would also get 0 at time 2. Okay, so anyone else, anyone who were to withdraw at time 2 would get 0, regardless of their type. And they would get a utility of 0. So let's consider what you would get if you were to withdraw at time 1. And here, because everyone else is doing the same thing, and because the bank cannot discriminate based on depositor types, it does not even know the type of a depositor who is withdrawing money at time 1. So everyone's going to be treated in the same way. And so we already said that the bank will only be able to repay their $1 to this fraction of investors. So what is the expected utility of investors then? Well, with this probability, if you withdraw at time 1, you're going to get your $1 back. So this is your $1, and this is a probability with which you would get your $1. And with the complementary probability, you're not going to get anything back, right? You're going to arrive after the bank is already bankrupt, after it has already run out of money, in which case you will get 0. Okay. And in this case, because everyone's doing the same thing, your expected utility does not depend on your type. The same thing for an impatient or a patient depositor. And so as you can see, because the utility function is increasing, as long as this probability is greater than 0, which it is, you are better off withdrawing money at time 1 rather than withdrawing at time 2. Okay, so in both cases, indeed, withdrawing at time 1 is the optimal strategy. So in other words, the panic equilibrium is indeed a Nash equilibrium. And the idea behind it is very simple, right? If you expect that everyone else is withdrawing their money from the bank, well, you do not want to be the last in line, because then the bank will already have run out of money. So you want to withdraw your money as well. This is why bank runs are a real phenomenon. Whenever you see that there's a line in front of a bank, so people are withdrawing their money from the bank, you want to join the queue because you want to get your money back before the bank goes bankrupt. So it makes sense on an individual level, right? And this is what we verified with this Nash equilibrium, right? Given what everyone else is doing, it makes sense to take the same action. And yet this is a coordination failure, right? Because this is going to be the expected utility of any investor, so impatient or patient. Everyone's going to get this in this panic equilibrium. Whereas if we were to go back to this so-called business as usual equilibrium, everyone will do better. If you're impatient, you get U of 1, which is greater than this. And if you're patient, you get even more. You get U of R, which is again greater than this. Okay. So if somehow depositors could coordinate, they would be better off trying to coordinate on this business as usual equilibrium. But again, if for some reason they expect other people to withdraw their money, then they should do so as well. And then there's a coordination failure and everyone is going to be worse off. And so this again emphasizes the importance of beliefs. We already mentioned that when we studied market inefficiency and whether investors believe that they will be in the fundamental equilibrium or in the noise trading equilibrium where noise trading demand affect prices. Here it is the same thing. It really matters whether depositors believe that it is a business as usual equilibrium in which people leave their money in the bank if they don't need it, or if they are in the panic equilibrium in which everyone is trying to get their money from the bank as fast as possible before the bank runs out of money. And so beliefs are extremely important. And so here there's this very interesting story from the 2008 crisis, in which, of course, some banks were facing bank runs and sometimes resulting in bankruptcy, but other banks were doing pretty well. And this was the case of HSBC, because of course, if you get your money out of a bank, you may not want to stuff it under your mattress. You may instead want to put your money into another stronger bank. And so this was happening to HSBC. They was facing lots of inflows. But then when customers go into the bank to open accounts, what happens is that when there's lots of them, there might be a queue. Customers might look like they are queuing. But think about it, at the time of a financial crisis, if a queue appeared in front of a bank, it would look like a bank run. And then if it looks like a bank run, all of the bank customers are going to come to the bank to try to withdraw their money from the bank. And so they wanted to avoid this perception. And this was actually very astute on the part of this head of retail banking at HSBC. And so what they were doing is that they were trying to make sure that there would not be a queue outside the bank. Do not let a queue appear under any circumstances, which on a fundamental level, so it doesn't change anything, right? But they were worried about perceptions, because in finance, especially when there's a potential for a coordination failure, perceptions affect reality. So they do matter. Another example of a bank run, so in which resulted in a bank failure, and Bear Stearns does not exist anymore. And so according to the SEC chairman, the problem of Bear Stearns was a lack of confidence and not a fundamental lack of capital. And this was a modern bank run. In a sense, it was not depositors trying to get their money back from their checking or savings account in the bank, but it was more short-term debt investors in Bear Stearns that refused to roll over their funding, that refused to refinance the bank. And this resulted in a lack of liquidity that resulted in a bank failure. Okay, according to Morris and Shin, again, same story. Lenders, so short-term lenders, stopped lending. So the bank could not refinance. And yeah, so the problem was on the liability side on the balance sheet rather than the asset side. So the low quality assets were often blamed during the financial crisis, and this was surely part of the story, but in many cases, refinancing problems due to a lack of confidence was also a big problem, and it was resulted in a classic bank run and a coordination failure. So this model is actually very relevant to understand what happened in the great financial crisis. So is there any more evidence that coordination failures and beliefs actually matter? And here this is in the case of corporate debt. And so in this paper, so the author studied a very interesting setting. So it was in Brazil, when a new law forced lenders to make their information publicly available to the public, and so including to other lenders. And when that happened, what they found out is that lenders that were disclosing their own negative information about a firm would then lend less to this firm, even though they would not learn anything. But they know that they were disclosing their negative information, so they know that other lenders to the firm would then acquire this information, that they may alter their behavior in consequence, for example, by not lending anymore to this corporation. And anticipating this, they themselves would stop lending. Okay. And finally, this is very relevant for sovereign debt. And so the idea behind this multiple equilibria is that if investors believe that a country will be unable to refinance its sovereign debt or will have difficulty doing so, then they're going to ask for higher interest rates, which would indeed make it harder or even impossible for the country to refinance its debt, and which may lead towards default. So in a sense, the belief of investors are going to be very important in terms of determining the eventual outcome. So beliefs will create reality.